Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
On the table between us, we have a very dense text.
Very dense.
Yeah, incredibly influential, though. It's Ernest Mandel's Introduction to Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 2.
A fascinating piece of work.
It really is. Now, before we go any further, I want to establish our mission for you, the listener. If Volume 1 of Capital is that isolated engine on the workbench,
Explaining the factory, the worker, how value is theoretically created.
right, then Volume 2 is the rush hour traffic jam.
It attempts to explain how the entire global economy breathes, how money and goods physically circulate.
And crucially, why that circulation so frequently chokes and breaks down.
Yeah, that's the big one.
So whether you're trying to make sense of modern macroeconomic theory, or you're just a person who lived through the 2020 global supply chain crisis.
Wondering why the shelves were suddenly empty.
Exactly. This text is essentially an attempt to map the invisible circulatory system of the marketplace. Our goal today is to unlock what historians have called a sealed book. Okay, let's unpack this. Before we even get into the math and the mechanics of this economic engine, I feel like we have to address a massive historical elephant in the room.
The reception of the book?
Yeah. This book, Capital Volume 2, was essentially ignored for decades. And not just by mainstream critics, but by Marx's most dedicated followers.
It's true.
How does a sequel to one of the most famous books in economic history just get brushed under the rug?
Well, it's a fascinating piece of literary trivia, largely because Friedrich Engels, who actually edited and published the volume after Marx died, he saw the disastrous reception coming from a mile away.
Wait, he knew he was publishing a dud?
He knew he was publishing something the audience was entirely unequipped to digest.
Oh!
Yeah. In the 1880s, Engels was writing letters to various prominent figures in the socialist movement, essentially doing damage control before the book even hit the presses.
Like who?
He wrote to the Russian populist Pyotr Lavrov and another associate named Friedrich Sorge, basically telling them to lower their expectations.
Seriously?
Yeah, he explicitly warned that Volume 2 would provoke disappointment because it was, quote, purely scientific.
Meaning it lacked the fire and brimstone of the first book.
Exactly. Engels noted that Volume 2 contained, in his words, not much material for agitation.
Because if you think about the audience for Volume 1, it had this immediate, visceral relevance to the working class.
Right. It was about the grueling conditions of the factory floor, the extraction of surplus value from the physical sweat of the worker. It was a call to arms.
And Volume 2?
Volume 2 deals almost entirely with questions that Engels described as being from one bourgeois to another.
Oh, man. So it's like an internal memo for accountants and supply chain managers rather than a manifesto?
That's a great way to put it. Engels wrote to a correspondent lamenting that the developments in the book were so dense and mathematically complex that the vulgar reader simply wouldn't take the trouble to fathom them.
Vulgar reader. Man, 19th century letter writing was so sharp.
Oh, he saved his sharpest critiques for the academic establishment, though.
Really?
Specifically the German academics of the time. He sarcastically called them the Catheter Socialisten.
The Catheter Socialisten. What does that mean?
It translates to the socialists of the chair, or academic socialists. Engels essentially diagnosed the state of political economy in Germany as having fallen so low that Volume 2 would always remain a sealed book to them.
Because they wouldn't even attempt to penetrate the formulas.
Exactly. And history proved him right, at least for a while. Official economic literature met the publication with absolute silence.
So if the academics ignored it and the activists found it too dry, who actually cracked the seal on this thing?
The breakthrough actually happened geographically far away from Germany, over in Russia.
Oh,
Yeah, it took an entire decade. But in the 1890s, young Russian economists, specifically men named Mikhail Tugen-Baranowski and later Sergei Bulgakov, were the first to really synthesize and apply it.
what were they using it for?
They used it to analyze the development of capitalism in Russia. And from there, it took almost another 10 years for those concepts to bounce back into Germany and the Western world.
So it sparked massive international debates eventually, but for a very long time, it just sat in the dark.
It really did.
To really grasp why it sat in the dark and why people bounced off it so hard, we need to visualize that shift in focus we mentioned earlier. Let's build out an analogy.
Okay, let's hear it.
If Volume 1 of Capital is the kitchen of a massive high-end restaurant, right? We're looking at the line cooks, the raw ingredients arriving at the back door.
The intense heat of the stoves.
Yeah. The actual physical creation of the meal. We're watching human labor transform raw meat and vegetables into a highly valuable dish. That's the production of value.
A very grounded, tangible process.
But then, Volume 2 completely steps out of the kitchen, the swinging doors close behind us. We are now standing in the dining room, looking at the customers, reading the menus.
Right, standing at the maitre d's podium looking at reservations.
Exactly. We're in the back office looking at the bank accounts, the lines of credit. We are no longer looking at how value is created.
We are looking at how that created value is actually realized as cash.
Yes. And Mandel argues that this specific transition is where so many readers, both historically and today, lose the thread.
Because they skip it.
Hmm.
He points out that skipping Volume 2 and jumping straight from Volume 1 to Volume 3 causes grave misunderstandings.
Which is a surprisingly common mistake among people trying to tackle Marx, right?
Very common. But you cannot simply understand how the meal is cooked and then jump to understanding how the restaurant empire distributes its dividends and franchises itself globally.
You completely miss the intermediate mechanism. You miss the actual transaction.
You miss the customer handing the money to the waiter. Marx termed this intermediate step the social intertwining of the different capitals.
And doing this changes the entire cast of characters in his analysis.
It does. The dramatis personae shifts. The center of gravity is no longer the industrialist standing over the factory worker.
So who are the main characters now?
Now, the main characters driving the narrative are the money owner, the wholesale merchant, the commercial banker, and the functioning capitalist trying to survive in a fluctuating market.
Oh, wait, I want to pause here because this is a massive departure from everything people associate with Marx.
It is.
The workers, the proletariat, the people who were the absolute center of the universe in Volume 1, you're saying they barely appear in this text.
It's a jarring shift, and Mandel explicitly notes that this causes significant surprise, even for modern academic economists.
I can imagine. So where are the workers?
When workers do appear in Volume 2, their role is fundamentally altered. They do not appear primarily as exploited producers of value sweating at the lathe.
Okay, so how do they appear?
They appear almost exclusively as buyers of consumer goods.
Wow, they become a market force.
Yes, they are a massive demographic of consumers spending their wages to buy back the very things they produced. They are a variable in aggregate demand.
They go from being the engine of production to a vector of consumer demand. That completely recontextualizes the analysis.
It does, and Mandel makes a very bold historical claim here. By making this specific shift, by aggregating workers into a consuming class and capitalists into an investing class, Marx was actually building the foundational predecessor to modern macroeconomics.
Wait, really? Before Keynes?
Long before Keynes. We were talking about aggregate flow techniques. Mandel traces the lineage back to François Quesnay, an 18th century physiocrat who created an early attempt to map the flow of wealth.
The tableau économique, right?
Exactly. But Mandel asserts that Marx's work in Volume 2 predated and anticipated the massive modern giants of macroeconomics, like Wassily Leontief and John Maynard Keynes.
So this volume is the bridge where economic theory moves from the microanalysis of a single commodity being made to the macroanalysis of capital reproducing itself.
Yes, as a massive interconnected totality.
Which means we're moving from looking at a single kitchen to looking at an entire global supply chain.
Precisely.
And that brings us to the core question. What is actually moving through the supply chain? Having stepped out into the marketplace, what is capital actually doing out here?
Well, Mandel makes it very clear that capital isn't just a static pile of gold sitting in a vault like Scrooge McDuck's money bin.
Right. If it just sits there, it isn't capital. It has to physically and conceptually transform to survive.
Survival requires motion. Capital must constantly circulate to remain capital. If the flow stops, the value evaporates.
So it has to keep changing.
Yeah. Mandel breaks down Marx's analysis of the three distinct forms that capital must take sequentially in order to complete a cycle of survival and growth.
Those three forms being money capital, productive capital, and commodity capital. And the text provides this incredibly vivid biological metaphor for this process. It calls it the metamorphosis of capital, comparing the entire lifespan of an investment to the life cycle of a butterfly.
It's a striking image that really helps ground the abstraction.
Let's walk the learner through this life cycle. First, you have the larva stage. This is money capital.
Right.
It's raw potential. It's hungry. It's just a liquid pile of cash sitting in a bank account ready to be deployed.
Then the capitalist takes that money and goes out into the market to buy very specific things, machinery, raw materials, and human labor.
And once those things are purchased and brought together inside a factory, we enter the chrysalis stage.
This is productive capital.
It's wrapped up. It's completely hidden away from the open market, gestating and transforming inside the opaque walls of the workplace.
The labor act on the raw materials using the machines.
And eventually, the chrysalis opens and out emerges the moth, the finished goods. This is commodity capital.
It could be a warehouse full of shoes, a lot full of cars, or a shipping container full of smartphones.
It has wings, it's out in the open world, and it is desperately looking for a buyer.
But the kicker here, the absolute biological imperative of this economic system, is that the moth must turn back into a larva.
Right. If the moth dies on the shelf, the cycle ends. Bankruptcy.
The commodities have to be sold so they can revert back into money capital. But, crucially, it must turn into a larger larva.
A larger pile of money capital, swollen with the surplus value that was secretly injected into it during the chrysalis phase.
That metamorphosis is the lifeblood of the system. Marx translates this butterfly metaphor into a famous, highly simplified formula for the basic circulation of capital.
And that formula, MCM prime, right?
Yes, MCM prime. Let's define that. Money, which is M, buys commodities, which is C, in order to sell them for more money, which is M prime.
So that prime symbol, the little tick mark next to the second M, represents the profit, the added value.
Exactly, the reason the capitalist undertook the process in the first place.
But Mandel is quick to point out that this basic MCM prime formula is way too simple to capture the gritty reality of industrial capitalism.
Oh, absolutely. It works for a merchant buying low and selling high, but it doesn't explain a massive factory like Henry Ford's.
So the text expands it into a much longer, somewhat intimidating algebraic sequence.
It looks complex on paper, but it simply maps the biological metaphor we just walked through.
What's the expanded formula?
It is M-C, then a less than sign pointing to MP and L, then ... P ... prime dash M prime.
Okay, that is a lot of letters. Let's take it piece by piece for the learner.
Right. You start with money, M, that money buys commodities, C, but the formula splits here to specify exactly what commodities the industrial capitalist buys.
Right, the MP and the L.
Yes, means of production, MP, which are the machines and raw materials, and labor, L.
So that first phase is the hungry larva acquiring its food. The capitalist is hiring workers and buying tons of raw steel.
Then you see a series of dots leading to the letter P. That P stands for production. That's the chrysalis phase. Work is happening.
And what do those dots represent?
The dots represent an interruption in circulation. They represent time passing while the capital is locked away from the market.
Oh, okay.
Then, after the P, you have more dots leading to C prime, that is the new commodity, the moth, imbued with new value.
And finally, a dash connects C prime to M prime. The moth is sold, completing the metamorphosis back into the swollen larva, more money. I want to focus on those dots for a second, the time factor, because time is not just a passive backdrop in this text.
Not at all.
Mandel emphasizes that in this framework, time is the absolute ruthless metric of survival for capital.
Time is the friction of the system. Mandel points out that the discontinuity of these three forms, the fact that money, production, and commodities exist as separate phases, is what allows the system to function at scale.
But it introduces massive vulnerabilities regarding time.
Huge vulnerabilities. To explain this, Marx makes a fundamental distinction between two types of capital based entirely on the velocity of their turnover.
He separates circulating capital from fixed capital. Let's define those clearly.
Circulating capital is the portion of your investment that is consumed and recovered very quickly, typically within a single production cycle.
Like what?
Think of a textile mill. You buy raw cotton, you pay your workers their weekly wages, the workers spin the cotton into yarn, you sell the yarn.
So the money you spend on the raw cotton and the wages is immediately recovered in the sale.
Right. It's back in your pocket, ready to buy next week's cotton and pay next week's wages.
It circulates fast, it's fluid, it moves through the system like blood pumping through a heart.
But fixed capital is entirely different. It is recovered agonizingly slowly over the course of many, many cycles.
This represents the heavy machinery, the industrial ovens, the physical factory building itself, right?
Exactly. If you purchase a $5 million metal stamping machine, you do not get that $5 million back after selling the first batch of stamped metal parts.
Of course not.
The machine transfers its value into the products fraction by fraction over perhaps a 10-year lifespan.
So within the exact same business, one part of your capital is sprinting a 50-yard dash, and the other part is running an incredibly slow 10-year marathon.
And Mandel derives something profound from this disparity. He notes that the longevity of that fixed machinery, the physical lifespan of the heavy equipment before it becomes obsolete, actually dictates the average duration of the overarching trade cycle.
Wait, in the wider economy?
Yes, the multi-year heartbeat of macroeconomic booms and recessions is intimately tied to the mass replacement cycles of fixed capital.
Okay, I need to push back or at least clarify something here because the logistics of this seem impossible.
Go.
The moth has to fly out into the world and find a buyer to turn back into money, right? But the factory, the Chrysalis, doesn't just shut its doors, send the workers home, and sit in silence waiting for a pair of shoes to sell in a retail store before it buys more leather.
No, the factory has to keep running every single day.
So doesn't continuity in the market actually require massive discontinuity behind the scenes?
You have hit on the exact core paradox that Marx highlights and Mandel unpacks.
Really?
Yes, continuous, seamless current production is only materially possible if stocks and financial reserves from previous cycles are desynchronized and readily available.
So while your current batch of moths is flying around the country looking for a buyer, the capitalist must have a separate reserve pile of larva liquid money ready to immediately start the next chrysalis phase.
Exactly, because if everything were perfectly synchronized, if you lived completely hand-to-mouth, the entire factory would freeze every time a shipping container got delayed at a port.
Or a product set on a shelf for an extra afternoon.
The system absolutely relies on constant, staggered metamorphoses overlapping each other in real time. Capital exists simultaneously in all three forms at once.
So a third of it is money in the bank, a third is in the factory being built, and a third is on trucks being delivered.
Yes.
That sounds incredibly fragile. It sounds like juggling, but instead of tennis balls, you're juggling an egg, a bowling ball, and a running chainsaw, and they're all moving at completely different velocities, and if you drop one, the whole act ends.
It is fundamentally fragile.
Yeah.
And that vulnerability, the desperate necessity for the moth to successfully turn back into money before the reserve larva runs out, brings us directly into the massive theoretical problem at the heart of the system.
Which is?
To successfully turn over, capital has to solve two separate massive hurdles at the exact same time.
Let's break down these two hurdles, because this is where Mandel starts systematically dismantling mainstream economic assumptions. First, you have the exchange value hurdle. The commodity must be sold. Someone, somewhere in the world, must have the actual cash on hand and the desire to buy the moth.
Because the value created by the workers in the factory is purely theoretical until the cash register actually rings. A warehouse full of unsold smartphones is economically worthless if no one buys them.
Okay, so you need money to flow. But the second hurdle is physical, the use value hurdle.
Yes.
The actual physical goods that the economy produces must be the exact right materials needed to restart the next cycle of production across the rest of the economy.
This is where Marx's architectural genius really shines, and Mandel's explanation is vital. Let's use an extreme hypothetical example to illustrate how catastrophic this dual requirement is.
Let's do it.
Imagine an entire isolated national economy that operates with incredible technological efficiency. But it only produces two categories of things: highly advanced automated factory machinery and basic consumer goods, let's say bread and winter coats.
Okay, sounds like a decent place to live. We have
Yeah.
advanced technology, we have plenty of food, and we're warm.
But what if, in their pursuit of efficiency, they forgot to allocate resources to extract raw materials? They produce zero coal, zero iron ore, and no spare mechanical parts.
What happens?
On day one, everything looks great. Everyone is well fed, the workers have warm coats, and the shiny new machines are humming perfectly. But machines inevitably experience wear and tear. They run out of fuel.
And because there are no physical spare parts or raw materials to replace them, production eventually grinds to an absolute halt.
Exactly. The physical use values available in the economy did not match the material needs of the next production cycle.
And we can flip that scenario. Imagine the economy produced only heavy machinery and mountains of raw materials, but completely neglected consumer goods.
Right, warehouses overflowing with iron and robot arms.
But there's no bread and no coats. The factories are fully stocked, but the workforce freezes and starves to death. Again, production halts entirely.
So for capital to reproduce itself on a societal scale, you don't just need an abstract volume of money flowing around. You need the exact right physical objects to be in the exact right place at the exact right time.
The physical use values produced must match the material requirements of the market perfectly.
And this dual necessity leads to Mandel's sharp critique of mainstream academic economics, specifically a concept known as Say's law.
We should define that for the learner because it dominated economic thought for a long time.
We should. Say's law, named after the classical economist Jean-Baptiste Say, essentially argues that supply creates its own demand.
The underlying logic is that the very act of producing a good and paying workers to make it generates the exact amount of income in the economy needed to buy that good.
Right. It assumes a natural, harmonious equilibrium where general overproduction is impossible.
And Mandel points out that Volume 2 thoroughly explodes Say's law. Marx demonstrates that academic theory, historically and even up to the present day, tends to split this dual problem down the middle and ignore the interaction between the two halves.
They look at the economy through a disconnected dichotomy.
Walk us through that split. How do modern economists separate it?
On one side, you have economists following the tradition of Wassily Leontief. They utilize input-output tables.
Like a massive spreadsheet.
Exactly. Imagine a complex spreadsheet where every row and column maps physical dependencies, how many tons of steel are physically required to manufacture how many automobiles, which require how much rubber.
Okay, so they are tracking the actual stuff. They're obsessed almost entirely with the physical use values.
Yes, the material balance of the economy. But on the other side, you have the Keynesian approach, stemming from John Maynard Keynes.
And what do they look at?
They look almost exclusively at disembodied money flows. Aggregate demand, national income, savings rates. They treat money like water flowing through a closed plumbing system, focusing on adjusting the pressure of the water.
So mainstream economics treats the economy like a plumbing system where the aggregate money flows completely independently of the pipes themselves, the actual physical goods being produced. But Marx's entire argument here is that you cannot separate the water from the pipes.
That is the core insight. You cannot separate the abstract income generated from the concrete physical thing that was produced to generate that income.
So Mandel emphasizes that a given national income structure, meaning who specifically holds the money, must correspond exactly to the commodity value structure, meaning what specific physical items were actually produced.
Yeah.
Give me a concrete example of that mismatch. How does the income structure fail to match the commodity structure?
Let's trace the behavior of different classes. Wages never buy heavy machinery. A factory worker takes their weekly paycheck and buys groceries, pays rent, maybe buys a television.
Right, they do not pool their money to buy industrial stamping presses or blast furnaces.
Capitalists, using their investment funds, buy machines. So imagine your economy produces $5 billion worth of consumer goods, bread, clothes, TVs. But the working class only receives $3 billion in aggregate wages.
You have a massive structural problem, because the capitalists aren't going to step in and personally eat $2 billion worth of extra bread. They want to spend their money on expanding their factories.
Precisely. The workers lack the purchasing power to clear the shelves of consumer goods, and the capitalists have money, but the goods they want, machinery, weren't produced in sufficient quantities.
So the bread rots, the money fails to flow back to the consumer goods sector, the consumer moth dies on the shelf, and the entire interconnected chrysalis cannot restart.
It breaks down entirely.
I think we all experienced a visceral, real-world version of this dichotomy during the 2020 global supply chain crisis.
We absolutely did.
Governments applied a Keynesian solution. They pumped trillions of dollars of stimulus money into aggregate demand. The water pressure was incredibly high. People had money to spend.
But the Leontief physical reality, the input-output table of use values, was broken.
You had ships stuck outside ports, a shortage of physical microchips, factories shut down by a virus. The money structure completely failed to match the physical commodity structure.
And the result was massive bottlenecks and inflation. It is a perfect modern illustration of Mandel's point.
The income structure must perfectly match the physical output structure for the system to reproduce smoothly.
And here is the devastating conclusion Marx draws. Because the capitalist system is fundamentally anarchic. Because every single individual company makes private, isolated decisions about what to produce.
And how much to produce, and how much to pay their specific workers without any central, overarching master plan.
Yes. Because of that, this perfect match between money and physical goods is an absolute miracle when it happens.
Which fundamentally alters how we view economic crises. Mainstream textbooks often teach that equilibrium, stable growth, and harmony are the baseline norm of the market.
Right, and that recessions or crises are weird external shocks, like a bad policy or a natural disaster.
But Marx asserts the exact mathematical opposite.
For Marx, equilibrium and harmonious growth are absolute exceptions under capitalism. They are brief, accidental moments of balance.
So what is the norm?
Disequilibrium, disproportion, and violent crises are the inherent mathematical norm. The system's internal architecture guarantees it will routinely fall out of balance.
And to prove exactly how mathematically difficult, almost impossible it is to achieve this harmonious equilibrium, Marx didn't just theorize.
No, he built a model, the famous reproduction schemas.
Let's transition into how Marx actually mapped the economy.
This specific section is where Volume 2 earns its intimidating reputation, because we move away from biological metaphors and dive into the algebra of macroeconomic flow.
But Mandel does a remarkable job of breaking down the logic. Let's walk the learner through it slowly. Marx takes the entire chaotic global economy and divides it into two massive primary departments.
Department I and Department 2.
What exactly are they?
Department I produces the means of production. This is the heavy industry: steel mills, coal mines, lumber yards, companies that manufacture factory robots and assembly line belts.
Their customers are not everyday people, their customers are other businesses.
Yes, exactly. Department 2 produces consumer goods: food, clothing, residential furniture, televisions. Their customers are the general consuming public.
Okay, that's a clean division. Department that builds the machines, Department 2 bakes the bread.
Now, Marx wants to establish a baseline. He wants to figure out what it mathematically takes for these two giant departments to simply survive from year to year, exactly as they are, without growing or shrinking.
He calls this state simple reproduction.
And to find the condition of equilibrium, he creates a formula.
Okay, I have the formula from Mandel's text right in front of me. It reads, IV plus IS equals IIC.
Right.
Okay, before our listeners tune out because we're doing algebra on an audio show, let's unpack this carefully. Let's define the variables first. What do the lowercase letters mean?
The Roman numerals I and I obviously represent the departments. The lowercase letters represent the specific value components of the commodities produced in those departments.
Let's look at Marx's labor theory of value here.
Yes. I stands for variable capital. This essentially represents the wages paid to the workers.
Why variable?
Marx calls it variable because human labor is the only thing that adds new variable value to the raw materials during production.
Okay, so V is wages. Next is S, which stands for surplus value.
This is the unpaid labor, the profit that is extracted and consumed by the capitalists.
And finally C.
C stands for constant capital. This represents the physical machinery and raw materials used up in production.
It's called constant because a machine doesn't create new value. It simply transfers its existing constant value into the new product as it wears down.
Exactly.
Okay, let me try to translate the formula IV plus IS equals IC using our earlier examples.
Go for it.
IV represents the wages of the steel workers and the robot builders. IS represents the personal profits consumed by the owners of those steel mills.
Right.
And IIC represents the physical wear and tear on the ovens and the raw flour used up by the bakers in Department 2.
Exactly right. So, if we read the formula IV plus IS equals IIC as a sentence, it means this: the total value of the consumer goods needed to sustain everyone in Department also.
The steelworkers spending their wages to survive, plus the steel bosses spending their profits on personal luxuries.
Must exactly equal the value of the replacement machinery and raw materials that Department of Setting needs to buy to keep baking bread at the exact same scale next year.
Wait, I need to visualize this physically to make it click.
Yeah.
Let's use some hypothetical numbers. Let's say the people making the machines in Department 2, I get paid $100 million in wages, and the owners take $50 million in profit to spend on themselves.
That's $150 million total they all need to eat.
And let's say the people baking the bread in Department 2 need $150 million worth of new ovens and flour to replace what they used up this year.
Right.
So the money the machine makers take to the bakery has to be the exact same amount of money the bakers need to take to the machine shop.
Yes. That is the razor's edge of equilibrium. If IV plus IS is larger than IIC, say $200 million to $150 million, it means the machine makers are showing up at the bakery trying to buy more bread than the bakers have the money to buy ovens.
The bakers run out of bread to sell, or the machine makers are left with unspent money.
And if the equation flips and it's smaller, the bakers have unsaleable bread sitting around rotting, and they cannot afford to replace their broken ovens.
That is a terrifyingly thin tightrope. And there's a crucial nuance Mandel points out here to prevent a misunderstanding. This isn't a primitive barter system.
No, not at all.
Department I doesn't just load up a freight train full of steel, drive it over to Department 2, and directly swap it for a train full of bread based on a handshake and mutual need.
No, because this is a capitalist commodity economy. Everything is mediated by money. The exchange requires a complex dual flow of both the physical commodities and the purchasing power.
Walk me through the mechanics of that dual flow. Trace the dollar bill for me.
Let's trace it. The workers in capitalist and department I have liquid money in their pockets, their wages and their profits. They take that money, walk over to Department 2, and buy consumer goods.
So, in step 1, money flows from Department 4 to Department 2, and physical bread flows from Department 2 to Department 4.
Okay, so now the workers in heavy industry are fed, and the bakers in Department 2 are holding all the cash.
Correct. Now for step 2. What do the capitalists in Department 2 do with that accumulated cash? Their ovens are broken. They need to replace the constant capital they used up.
So they take that exact same money, walk back over to Department 1, and purchase means of production. Money flows back from Department 2 to Department 4, and physical ovens flow from Department 1 to Department 2.
And the cycle is complete. The money has perfectly mediated the exchange, returned to its starting point in Department 4, and both departments now have the exact physical items they need to start the next year's production.
That is the miraculous condition of simple reproduction. But it requires human behavior to conform perfectly to the algebraic model.
And that raises a massive red flag. What if human psychology gets in the way?
Let's introduce a hypothetical.
Yeah. What if the workers in department, I read a scary headline about a looming recession, they get nervous. So instead of spending their $100 million in wages on bread, they decide to stuff 20% of it under their mattresses.
They save their money.
What happens to the math?
The math instantly breaks, and the physical reality collapses with it. If the workers in Department I save 20% of their money, they don't buy that portion of bread from Department 2.
The bread sits on the shelves and spoils.
Department 2 experiences a shortfall in revenue. They don't get the money they expected. Because Department 2 didn't get the money, they literally cannot afford to buy the necessary replacement ovens from Department Ho.
Department Ho now has ovens sitting in warehouses unsold. The moth cannot become the larva.
The entire system begins to freeze up and spiral into a recession, all triggered by a perfectly rational, individual human decision to save money in an uncertain time.
Wow. By mapping the flow this meticulously, this mathematical model visually demonstrates just how inherently fragile the system is to the slightest disruption.
It does.
And we have to remember that was just simple reproduction, a theoretical state where the economy just treads water and stays the exact same size. Mandel notes that the defining characteristic of historical capitalism is expanded reproduction, relentless growth.
Right, the capitalists don't just consume their profits on luxuries. They ruthlessly reinvest a portion of that surplus value to buy more machines and hire more workers to actively expand their empires.
And if you think the formula for simple reproduction is a tightrope walk, the formula for expanded reproduction is trying to walk a tightrope over a Category 5 hurricane.
Because now the coordination required is astronomical. Department A has to produce exactly enough extra machines, not just to replace the old ones, but to facilitate the uncoordinated planned growth of both Department Ed itself and Department 2.
And simultaneously, Department A has to somehow anticipate this and produce exactly enough extra food and clothing to sustain the newly hired workers in both departments.
And the money flows, the investments, the credit lines, they all have to scale and match perfectly across both sectors.
Which, as we established when we talked about the anarchy of the market, is virtually impossible when every single company is planning their growth independently, hiding their strategies from their competitors.
Which mathematically guarantees periodic crises of disproportion. The system will inevitably overproduce in one sector and underproduce in another.
That is Mandel's ultimate takeaway from the schemas. Marx didn't invent these algebraic formulas to show how perfectly and rationally capitalism works. He built them to show the exact, almost impossible, miraculous conditions required for it to work at all.
By mapping the required perfection, he proved that violent breakdowns and crises are an inescapable feature of the architecture.
Okay, so because these reproduction schemas are so incredibly logical and honestly so mathematically satisfying to look at when they balance out, it leads to a massive historical irony.
It really does.
And this brings us to the historical debates around the misapplication of these formulas. People started picking up Marx's math and using it for projects it was fundamentally never designed for.
Yes, the clarity of the math proved too tempting. This sparked a massive, multi-generational historical debate involving major economic and political figures like Rosa Luxemburg, Rudolf Hilferding, and moving into the mid-20th century, Maurice Staub.
And what was the core issue?
The core issue emerged when Soviet and East European economists in the early days of centralized planning looked at Marx's reproduction schemas and had a revelation. They thought, Here it is, the master equation.
This is the mathematical blueprint for planning a socialist economy.
Exactly.
Well, if you're a Soviet planner tasked with organizing an entire nation's output, I can see the appeal. If the math works to perfectly balance heavy industry in Department T and consumer goods in Department 2, why not just use the math to run the country? What is the problem with that?
The problem is that it represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what the variables in the algebra actually represent in the real world. Mandel is intellectually brutal in his critique of this practice.
How so?
He points out that Marx's schemas are explicitly designed to map commodity production. They map the flow of exchange value under the specific social relations of capitalism.
The variables we just discussed, wages representing exploited variable capital and profit representing extracted surplus value, are specific to a system driven by private profit.
Right, because earlier we established that capitalism is utterly obsessed with the exchange value, the money, the larva. The physical use value is just a vehicle to get more money.
Exactly. Applying value-based schemas to a post-capitalist or socialist society, where the stated ideological goal is entirely different, leads to severe logical and human absurdities.
In a theoretical socialist society, as Marx outlined it, goods are not produced as commodities to be sold on a market for a profit. They are produced as pure use values and distributed according to a conscious social plan to meet human needs.
If your central planners try to maximize a surplus value in a society that is supposedly dedicated to abolishing surplus value, you break the internal logic of the system.
You end up recreating capitalist exploitation under a red flag.
And this brings us to the Maurice Dobb debate, which Mandel highlights prominently in the text. I want to dig into this because it takes this abstract math and shows the devastating real-world consequences of getting the theory wrong.
It's a prime example.
Who was Maurice Dobb, and what exactly did he argue?
Maurice Dobb was a highly influential Marxist economist who participated in a massive debate in the 1950s concerning the trajectory of Soviet economic planning.
What was the debate about?
Specifically, it centered over Joseph Stalin's economic doctrine, which was the law of the priority development of the means of production.
Okay.
Dobb essentially used the internal logic of Marx's reproduction schemas to mathematically prove and justify this Stalinist policy. He argued that if a socialist society wanted to increase the output of consumer goods in the future, it must mathematically prioritize the hypergrowth of Department I heavy industry right now.
So the logic is, build more steel mills, coal mines, and tractor factories today, and restrict consumer goods so that eventually, decades from now, we will have enough machines to make infinite amounts of bread and clothing.
That was the mathematical justification. But Mandel points out the devastating, fatal flaw in taking a capitalist growth model and applying it to socialist planning.
What's the flaw?
By treating the economy as an exercise in maximizing mathematical commodity growth on a spreadsheet, this exact logic was used by state planners to rationalize sacrificing the consumption, the comfort, and the living standards of 4 entire generations of workers.
Oh, wow. All just to mathematically ensure a higher theoretical rate of growth for some hypothetical 5th generation down the line.
Yes.
Wait, let me make sure I'm grasping the scale of this. For roughly 100 years, the working population is told to tighten their belts, to suffer through chronic shortages of basic clothes, decent housing, and food, just so the heavy industry sector can continually hit an abstract growth target derived from a capitalist mathematical model.
Yes. The math became a justification for immense material deprivation. Mandel argues this approach has absolutely nothing to do with a genuine socialist norm.
So what would the alternative be?
For Mandel, reading Marx closely, a post-capitalist society would plan its economy around use values, not the accumulation of exchange values.
Right.
The overarching goal wouldn't be maximizing the mathematical growth rate of total value. The goal would be the optimum satisfaction of human needs with the lowest possible expenditure of human labor time.
It's the difference between asking, how do we make the GDP number go up infinitely, versus asking, how do we organize our resources so that everyone has a comfortable house while reducing the work week to 20 hours?
That is the precise distinction. Mandel insists that believing socialist planning is merely about maximizing commodity value or profit, just managed by the state instead of private CEOs, is a disastrous theoretical error.
An error that led to immense social miscalculations, hardship, and ultimately economic stagnation in the Eastern Bloc.
Exactly.
It is fascinating to look at this strictly as an analytical tool, observing how theory translates into history. Regardless of one's political stance on the Cold War, Mandel's critique highlights a massive mathematical mismatch in how these planners operated.
You cannot take a mathematical model explicitly designed to map the contradictions and profit-driven motive of capital and seamlessly paste it over a system that claims to be driven by human need.
It's like using the rule book for chess to try and win a game of basketball. The pieces fundamentally do not move that way, and if you try, people get hurt.
That implies the underlying social relations dictate the math, not the other way around. If you change the social relations, you have to throw out the old algebra.
Okay, so this strict, rigorous focus on what constitutes capitalist value versus what constitutes human use value leads us into the final major concept Mandel tackles.
The productive versus unproductive labor debate.
And I have to warn the learner, this is arguably the most hotly debated, counterintuitive, and honestly provocative section of Mandel's introduction. We are going to explore Marx's definition of productive versus unproductive labor.
This is inevitably the section where readers struggle the most. They project their own deeply held moral values onto Marx's cold analytical framework, which causes endless confusion and resistance.
I completely understand why. Because in everyday colloquial language, if I call someone productive, it is a compliment. I mean, their work is good, it is socially useful, it helps the community.
Right, building a hospital for the sick is productive. Teaching a child to read is productive.
But we have to set some ground rules for this section. Check your moral judgments at the door. Because in this specific text, the word productive has absolutely nothing to do with morality, ethics, or social usefulness.
If we pull back and remember the overarching framework we've been painting, we have to evaluate labor strictly under the mechanics of the capitalist mode of production.
Under capitalism, what is the prime directive? What is the singular goal of the system?
The goal is the expansion of capital. It is the creation of surplus value to swell the larva into a larger larva. Therefore, Marx defines productive labor incredibly narrowly.
How does he define it?
Productive labor is only labor that is exchanged against capital to create surplus value embodied in commodities, thereby enriching capital as an aggregate whole.
So, if your labor doesn't make the total pie of capitalist value physically bigger, you are not considered productive.
Exactly. Unproductive labor, within this specific ruthless framework, is labor that merely redistributes or consumes the surplus value that has already been created by someone else in the productive sector.
Okay, let's use the exact examples Mandel pulls from the text, because they are wild, and they perfectly illustrate how entirely divorced this definition is from human morality. Let's look at a doctor.
A doctor is highly useful. They heal the sick, they save lives. Their labor is physically indispensable for human survival and well-being.
But from the strict viewpoint of expanding the total mass of capital in society, a doctor operating an independent practice and charging a fee from your salary is performing unproductive labor.
You are paying them out of your personal revenue, your wages. They are not exchanging their labor with a capitalist to create a physical commodity that embodies surplus value to be sold on the open market.
They provide a service that consumes value rather than expanding capital.
Exactly.
Okay, now contrast the life-saving doctor with a factory worker whose job is producing dum-dum bullets, or highly addictive hard drugs, or cheap exploitative pornographic magazines.
From a societal, ethical, or moral standpoint, those items might be considered entirely useless or actively violently harmful to humanity.
But under the logic of capitalism, they are commodities. They find willing buyers.
The worker in the bullet factory is exchanging their labor against the factory owner's capital. They are embedding their labor into a physical commodity that is then sold for a profit, which actively expands the total mass of capital in the world.
Therefore, within the architecture of Volume 2, the bullet maker is performing productive labor, and the life-saving doctor is not.
That is a severe departure from how we normally use that word. It is a completely alien way to view human effort.
But it makes perfect, ruthless sense within the internal logic of a system optimized only for profit. Let's look at another example from the text, because the distinction gets even more granular when we look at how goods move. Let's trace the life of a television set.
This television example is the perfect way to understand the barrier between production and circulation. If you work in an electronics factory assembling the physical components of a television set, you are engaging in a labor process that acts upon and transforms physical nature.
You are taking plastic, glass, and rare earth metals and embedding abstract social labor into a new physical use value. You are creating a commodity.
You are baking the pie. That is productive labor.
Okay, the TV is built, the Chrysalis opens, the Moth is born. The TV goes on a truck and arrives at a massive big box retail store. There is a clerk at that store who spends their entire 8-hour shift on their feet, answering customer questions, demonstrating the TV's features, ringing up the sale on the register, and physically carrying the box to the customer's car.
They are working incredibly hard.
They are employed by a retail capitalist. Are they productive?
According to Mandel's strict reading of Volume 2, no. They are entirely unproductive.
I have to play devil's advocate here. Why? They are the ones securing the bag. They are helping the boss make money. If they don't sell the TV, the boss goes bankrupt.
They are absolutely helping their specific individual boss realize a profit, yes. But we have to look at the macro level. The clerk is not adding a single atom of new value to the television itself.
The television was not physically altered or made more objectively valuable by being run up at a cash register. All of its value was entirely created by the worker back in the factory.
So what is the clerk actually doing? The clerk in the store, the bank teller financing the credit card purchase, the advertising executive who made the commercial for the TV, they all operate entirely in the sphere of circulation.
Their labor merely facilitates the metamorphosis of the commodity back into money. They are an expense.
They are redistributing the surplus value that was already created by the factory worker. For capital as a whole, they do not bake a bigger pie. They just help the retail capitalist grab a slice of the pie from the industrial capitalist.
Okay, but what about transportation? Because Mandel brings the specific industry up, and moving things around feels like a service, not manufacturing. If I drive a truck for a living, I'm not physically building a TV.
This raises a brilliant and highly specific nuance Marx introduces. Transporting goods freight shipping is considered productive labor.
Why?
Because the use value of a commodity is only actually realized in its consumption. A television sitting in a factory warehouse in Taiwan is functionally useless to a consumer sitting in an apartment in Chicago.
The physical change of location is an unavoidable material necessity to realize the object's use value.
Therefore, the transport industry is viewed as a continuation of the production process. The truck driver actually adds spatial value to the product being transported.
Okay, I follow that. Moving the physical TV makes the TV more practically valuable. But what if I drive a city bus full of people? Passenger transport.
Unproductive.
Wait, really? I'm still driving a massive vehicle. The physical labor of driving is the exact same.
The physical labor is the same, but the economic result is entirely different. When you drive a bus full of commuters, you are not transporting a physical commodity to market in order to realize its embedded value.
You are transporting human beings. It is a personal service. It doesn't add value to an object.
The service is consumed simultaneously in the exact moment of its production, and it is paid for out of the passenger's personal revenue. It does not augment the total mass of social value and surplus value in the economy.
Okay, I want to push back a bit harder on behalf of the retail clerks, the cashiers, and the accountants, because there is an academic critique mentioned in the text that seems very intuitive.
The Morishima critique.
Yeah, Mandel brings up the critique by the Japanese economist Michio Morishima. If I'm a commercial clerk and I work for a massive, multi-billion-dollar retail corporation like Walmart or Amazon, my labor absolutely makes my corporate boss incredibly rich. My labor generates millions in profit for my specific company. How can you look me in the eye and say I am economically unproductive?
Morishima's critique represents the common sense of the microeconomy.
Yeah.
But Mandel defends Marx by insisting on the aggregate macro-level view. At the micro level, looking only at the balance sheet of one specific company, the commercial clerk is productive for their individual boss. The clerk's labor allows the retail capitalist to secure their slice of the total profit.
But Marx is analyzing the system as a massive, unified totality. We have to zoom all the way out.
Right. Imagine you take all the capitalists in the entire world, the factory owners, the retail kings, the bankers, and you put them all in one giant room.
Okay.
And you put all the workers in the world in another room.
Here.
From the perspective of the entire capitalist system, the workers in the factories making the physical goods, mining the coal, building the machines, they are the only ones actually adding new value to the total pile of wealth in the capitalist room.
The commercial clerks, the bankers, the admin, the real estate brokers, they are just moving the existing wealth around inside the room.
They're a necessary friction, a necessary expense of circulation required to keep the system moving, but they do not create new aggregate wealth.
Wow, that completely shifts your perspective. If you adopt that specific Marxist framework, it entirely changes how you look at a modern city's skyline.
It does.
You look at Manhattan or London, all those massive glittering bank towers, the insurance skyscrapers, the advertising agencies, the corporate law firms. In this framework, they are not engines of wealth creation.
They are massive, glittering monuments to unproductive labor. They are simply the accumulated friction of the moth, desperately trying to turn back into money.
It is a radically different lens through which to view the structure of a modern service economy. It strips away the illusion of financial markets and forces you to look specifically at where the physical, material transformation of nature actually occurs.
It's powerful.
So who actually makes up the working class? Because Mandel starts his analysis by completely redefining the proletariat.
He does. He immediately dismantles the narrow, stereotypical definition of the working class that most people hold in their heads. I mean, if you ask the average person to picture a proletarian, they usually picture a manual industrial worker.
Right, like the classic 19th century factory worker holding a wrench covered in soot.
Yeah, someone in a hard hat working on an assembly line, or maybe a coal miner. But Mandel argues that under Marx's actual analysis, that imagery represents a complete misunderstanding of the theory.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The proletariat is not defined by the physical nature of the work at all.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with whether you swing a hammer or type on a keyboard. It is defined entirely by the socioeconomic compulsion behind the work.
Okay, so the working class includes anyone who is forced by economic necessity to sell their labor power to survive.
Exactly.
So if you don't own the factory, you're a worker.
Well, it goes a bit deeper and more specific than that. Mandel lists 3 specific constraints that objectively define a proletarian. First, non-ownership of the means of production. You don't own the factory, you don't own the server farm or the land.
Makes sense.
Second, a lack of direct access to the means of livelihood, meaning you can't just go out into the woods and freely farm the land to feed yourself because the land is already enclosed and owned by someone else.
Right, the frontier is closed.
Exactly. And third, insufficient money to purchase the means of livelihood without the continuous ongoing sale of your labor power.
Okay, wow. This completely reshapes the board then. This means that unproductive wage earners, like commercial clerks, office workers, domestic servants, and even state employees, are fundamentally just as proletarian as the guy swinging a hammer in a steel mill.
Yes. And I should clarify, in Marxist terminology, the word productive doesn't mean useful to society.
Oh, okay. What does it mean?
It specifically means labor that produces surplus value for a capitalist. So a worker in a car factory is productive because they build a physical commodity that is sold for capital's profit.
Right.
But a clerk in a state-run hospital, a public school teacher, or a domestic servant does not produce a physical commodity that a capitalist sells for profit. So their labor is technically unproductive in a strictly Marxist economic sense.
Oh, I see.
But socially and economically, because they are still trapped by those 3 constraints we mentioned, they must sell their time and energy just to survive. They are entirely, fundamentally part of the proletariat.
But wait, we have to draw a boundary line somewhere, right?
Yeah.
What about a high-level corporate manager? Let's say a modern executive making, I don't know, $300,000 or $400,000 a year. Technically, they don't own the company. They receive a W-2 form. They receive a salary. Do they meet those 3 constraints? Are they the proletariat?
No. Mandel is very explicit about this boundary. It is absurd to extend the concept of the proletariat to all wage and salary earners without limitation. The dividing metric here is the ability to accumulate capital.
Okay, break that down for me. How does accumulation change their class?
If your salary level permits you to accumulate capital, in addition to maintaining what society considers a normal standard of living, you are excluded from the proletariat.
Ah, got it.
Yeah, the executive making hundreds of thousands of dollars is not living paycheck to paycheck under the strict socioeconomic compulsion to sell their labor just to eat. They have massive surplus income, which they can and do invest in stocks, real estate, or other capital-generating assets.
So they basically buy their way out of the working class.
Precisely. They can, to a modest or sizable degree, become owners of capital themselves. Therefore, even though they draw a salary, they act as part and parcel of the capitalist class, or at least its managerial extension. The true proletarian has insufficient money to do anything other than reproduce their own ability to work the next day.
That makes perfect sense. The dividing line isn't the paperwork you fill out. It's whether your wage traps you in a cycle of mere survival or whether your wage allows you to buy your way into the owning class. But this broad definition of the working class brings up a massive theoretical conflict regarding those state employees we mentioned, teachers, public health workers, sanitation workers. If these state employees don't produce physical surplus value for a capitalist, Aren't they just draining resources from the industrial workers who do?
Oh, this was a fierce debate among Marxist theorists for decades.
Yeah.
Because the objection goes like this. If only the industrial productive workers create new economic value, then the wages of the unproductive state workers must be paid out of the surplus value created by those industrial workers.
Right.
And if that's true, it creates a structural conflict of interest within the working class itself. The industrial worker naturally wants to keep as much of the value they produce as possible, but the state worker needs higher taxes levied on the industrial worker to fund their own salary.
Yeah, that seems like a brutal zero-sum game. Let's use an analogy. It's like a modern company's budget, right? Just because the IT department doesn't directly sell the software the company makes, it doesn't mean they aren't essential to keeping the servers running. You need IT. But if you're the aggressive sales team making the actual revenue, you might look at a massive bloated IT budget and say, hey, every dollar going to them is coming out of my year-end bonus.
Right.
So if state workers are paid through taxes deducted from industrial workers' wages, aren't they competing for the exact same slice of the economic pie?
It absolutely looks that way on the surface, which is why the debate was so heated. But Mandel argues strongly against this perspective. He counters this zero-sum game at two distinct levels. First, he points out a crucial distinction in Marxist economic theory. The concept of gross wages, meaning your wages before tax, has essentially no meaning.
No meaning. Try telling that to someone looking at their pay stub and seeing 30% of their money vanishing into tax deductions.
I know. It is entirely counterintuitive to how we operate and think about our finances today. But in this theoretical framework, you have to look at what a wage actually is. A wage is strictly the means of reconstituting the worker's labor power.
Reconstituting labor power.
Yes. It is the actual physical basket of goods and services the worker takes home to be able to survive and return to work the next day. Therefore, only net real wages matter. The money deducted from a worker's gross wage as taxes to buy, say, military fighter jets was never really the worker's wage to begin with. It was, from the very outset, part of the social surplus value extracted by the capitalist system.
Ah, I see. So the capitalist class and the state just use the gross wage as an accounting fiction. They tell the worker, you earn $100, but we're taking $30 for taxes. But from a Marxist perspective, the worker's labor power was only ever valued at $70. The other $30 was surplus value extracted at the point of production, just routed through a different administrative channel.
You've captured the logic perfectly. And the second, even more important point Mandel makes is about how we must view social services. State medical care, public education, public transport. These should not be construed as deductions from the surplus value that rightfully belongs to the worker. Instead, Mandel categorizes them as a socialized portion of the wage.
A socialized portion of the wage, meaning it's part of the total compensation the working class receives as a whole to keep them functioning.
Let's follow the mechanics of it. Whether an individual worker pays for a doctor out of pocket from their own net wage, or whether the state provides that exact same doctor for free using pooled tax money, the economic function is the exact same. It is reconstituting the worker's labor power.
Right.
It maintains the worker and their family under normal living conditions so they can continue to participate in the economy. Therefore, expanding public health or education isn't draining the industrial worker. It is actually increasing the total price of labor power across the board. It is a victory for the working class as a whole.
So when governments institute austerity measures and cut back on social state expenditures, it's not actually a tax savings for the worker. It's a savage attack on their overall living standards. It's a direct cut to their socialized wage.
Exactly. And Mandel goes out of his way to note that the historical growth of these social services established an entirely new minimum standard of living, far beyond the purely physiological bedrock of Marx's time.
Right, because society evolves.
Precisely. Workers today need more than just bread and a roof to function in a modern economy. They need literacy, technical education, healthcare, and infrastructure. That is the new baseline value of their labor power.
So if we have radically redefined who is actually making the value, and we understand that millions of state and service workers are part of this massive proletariat engine, well, we naturally have to look at what kinds of goods are being made with all that extracted value.
We do.
If we move past consumer goods and infrastructure, Mandel pivots to look at goods that don't help the working class at all. He addresses a problem that has plagued economists for a century. What exactly is the economic function of producing extreme luxury goods and weapons of war?
This is a critical pivot in his analysis.
Right.
Mandel asks us to consider the stark difference between building a tractor and building a missile.
Right, because if I build a factory that makes tractors, those tractors can be used to farm wheat. That wheat feeds workers. Those workers then go build more factories or invent new technologies. It's a compounding cycle of growth.
Exactly.
But if I build a multi-million-dollar luxury yacht or a heat-seeking missile, neither of those things goes back into the economic engine. The yacht just sits in a private marina for a billionaire, and the missile literally blows itself up.
You've just beautifully illustrated what Marxists call the main departments of production. In this framework, Department I produces means of production: machinery, raw materials, the steel, and the tractors you mentioned.
Okay, Department I's machines.
Yes. And Department II produces consumer goods: food, clothing, housing, the things that reconstitute the labor force. Both of these departments contribute to what is called expanded reproduction.
Expanded reproduction meaning growth.
Right. They allow the capitalist system to grow, to accumulate more capital, and to expand the overall scale of production cycle after cycle.
But the yacht and the missile don't fit in either of those categories.
No, they belong to a sort of Department the Third.
Yeah.
And here's the fascinating mechanical reality. Producing a yacht or a missile does create surplus value. The capitalist who owns the missile factory makes a massive profit. The workers there are exploited for their surplus labor just like anywhere else.
So someone is getting rich off it.
Oh, definitely. However, the final product does not contribute to expanded reproduction. As you pointed out, the missile doesn't build new machines, and it doesn't feed hungry workers. It's essentially a black hole for capital accumulation.
Right.
The wealth goes in, profit is extracted, but the product itself exits the reproductive cycle of the economy forever.
So why does the system produce them at such massive global scales? Why would capitalism, a system entirely obsessed with compounding growth and accumulation, intentionally dump trillions of dollars of value into a black hole?
To understand that, we have to diagnose a specific recurring disease within the capitalist system, a condition Mandel calls a plethora of capital.
A plethora, an overabundance. That sounds like a good thing, doesn't it? Having too much capital, isn't that the goal?
It is a terminal disaster for the system. Overproduction of capital means there are massive sums of wealth that simply cannot find profitable investment. Imagine an economy where the market is entirely saturated. Consumers can't afford to buy any more cars or refrigerators.
Because they're tapped out.
Exactly. And because no one is buying, industrialists stop building new factories. So now you have a society with stagnant, hoarded wealth sitting in bank accounts or government bonds, generating only a miserable low interest rate rather than a high industrial rate of profit.
Right.
And on the physical side, this plethora of capital manifests as huge stocks of unused raw materials rusting in warehouses, silent, idle factories, and massive reserves of unemployed workers desperate for a wage. The engine has stalled because there is nowhere profitable to steer it.
So the money is just sitting there completely frozen while millions of people are out of work and perfectly good factories gather dust.
And this is where the arms sector steps in as a terrifyingly effective, albeit temporary savior. If the government decides to launch a massive rearmament program, they suddenly inject artificial life into the stagnant system. The government borrows that hoarded, stagnant money and starts ordering thousands of tanks, planes, and missiles. Suddenly, those idle factories are running at full capacity. Those unemployed workers are hired. They start earning wages again, which they immediately spend on consumer goods providing Department II. The weapons factories buy massive amounts of steel, electronics, and coal, which stimulates Department OIS.
It's a massive stimulus package. It's like drinking a highly caffeinated energy drink when you are completely exhausted.
That's a great way to put it.
Like you've been staring at a wall for 3 hours, your brain is foggy. You chug a 300 milligram energy drink and suddenly your heart is racing, your pupils dilate, you are typing at 100 words a minute, and the whole biological system is just firing on all cylinders. But, and here is the crucial distinction, it provides zero actual nutrition to the body. It's empty calories. There's no expanded reproduction of healthy cells, just an artificially induced spike in activity that guarantees a brutal physical crash later.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what happens when you drink that energy drink every single day? Your body builds a tolerance, your adrenal glands burn out, and eventually the baseline exhaustion is so deep that the caffeine stops working entirely.
Right.
Mandel traces this exact dynamic through macroeconomic history. Look at the massive global arms drives preceding World War I, or the staggering rearmament in the 1930s following the Great Depression. In both cases, military Keynesianism, using massive military spending to prop up a stagnant, dying economy, created a spectacular temporary boom. It pulled the global economy out of the mud.
But I have to push back hard here, because historically, didn't the massive rearmament of WWII actually save the global economy? I mean, it definitively pulled America out of the Great Depression, it built the greatest middle class in history, and it set up an unprecedented post-war economic boom that lasted for decades. So how can Mandel argue it's just an empty calorie trap that guarantees a harder crash? The post-war era wasn't a crash, it was a golden age.
It's a brilliant question, and it's the exact defense mainstream economists use. But Mandel argues that you were looking at the wrong variable. It wasn't the production of arms that saved global capitalism and triggered the Golden Age. It was the unprecedented apocalyptic destruction caused by those arms.
The destruction.
Yes, to understand why the temporary boom of arms production is ultimately a trap, we have to introduce a core concept of Marxist mechanics: the organic composition of capital.
Okay, let's define that term clearly. The organic composition of capital. What exactly does that measure?
In simple terms, it is the ratio between the money a capitalist spends on machinery and raw materials, which Marx calls constant capital, versus the money spent on human wages, which is variable capital.
So it's the ratio of machines to human labor.
Yes. As capitalism develops, it naturally relentlessly pushes for technological upgrades to beat the competition. A factory goes from having 100 workers using hand tools to 10 workers operating a massive automated assembly line. The proportion of investment shifts heavily, irreversibly toward machinery. The organic composition of capital rises.
Which seems like incredible progress, right? We get more efficiency, cheaper goods.
It is progress in terms of raw physical output, but it is fatal for the Marxist rate of profit. Because in this theoretical framework, only living human labor creates new surplus value.
Wait, really? Only human labor?
Yes. A machine cannot be exploited. A machine just transfers its existing prepaid value into the product slowly as it wears down. If you replace humans with machines, your total mass of physical products increases, but the actual amount of newly created surplus value per product shrinks. Therefore, the average rate of profit inevitably, mathematically, tends to fall across the whole system.
Wow. Okay, let me connect the dots here. By using the arms race to stimulate the economy, the government forces the creation of more and more advanced, highly automated factories to build complex missiles and planes. This drives human labor out of the equation relative to the massive machinery required, which mathematically depresses the rate of profit across the whole system.
Exactly. The initial military boom creates full employment and high investment, which rapidly raises the organic composition of capital, which eventually chokes the rate of profit. When the profit rate drops, productive investment starves. The system crashes again.
So it's a trap.
Yes. So returning to your pushback about WWII, the arms production in the 1930s led to a dropping rate of profit. What reset the system wasn't the tanks rolling off the assembly line. It was the fact that WWII physically annihilated half of the industrialized world. European and Japanese factories were bombed to dust. Massive amounts of global capital were destroyed. It was a staggering devalorization of capital.
Oh, wow. So because everything was destroyed, they had to start from scratch.
Exactly. Because so much constant capital was wiped out, the survivors, primarily the United States, could start the accumulation process all over again with a massively restored rate of profit. You cannot permanently cure capitalist stagnation with weapons production. You are just delaying the crisis and ensuring the resulting explosion will be infinitely more destructive.
That is a profoundly staggering, almost chilling way to view the military-industrial complex, not just as a political lobby of hawkish generals and greedy contractors, but as a desperate, mathematically doomed pressure valve for stagnant wealth. It's the engine vibrating so violently it has to burn off its own excess parts just to keep running.
It really is.
Now, if arms and luxury goods are these black holes for expanded reproduction, who else is taking a cut of the surplus value without physically producing anything? We've talked about the factory worker and the factory owner, but there is a massive layer of the economy sitting between them and the consumer. Let's examine the role of the middlemen, commercial and financial capital, the retailers, the wholesale buyers, and the bankers.
This addresses a central riddle in Marxist theory. We established that surplus value is created by productive labor in the factory. The industrial capitalist, the factory owner, extracts this value. So why on earth does the industrialist willingly hand over a massive chunk of that hard-earned surplus value to commercial capitalists like retail stores and to banking capitalists?
Right. The banker didn't build the car. The retail showroom didn't build the car. They don't create any new value. They just move paper and keys around. So why does the factory owner share the pie with them? Why not keep it all?
To understand this, Mandel introduces the vital time dimension that dominates Volume 2 of Capital. You have to look at the lifespan of capital, not just its physical location. Productive capital only creates value when it is actively engaged in the production process. When workers are on the clock, machines are running, and raw materials are being physically transformed.
Makes sense. A factory with the lights turned off makes zero money.
But the life cycle of capital isn't just production. It's also circulation. Let's build a hypothetical scenario. Let's say it takes an industrialist 3 months to manufacture a batch of 10,000 cars. The workers sweat for 3 months, the value is created. But the industrialist can't pay his workers in cars, he needs cash.
Right.
And it takes him another 3 months to slowly find buyers, ship the cars across the country, and finally sell them on the market to realize that profit in cash.
So for 3 months, the factory is just waiting. The assembly line is dark because they are waiting for the cash to come back so they can buy more steel and pay the workers for the next batch.
Precisely. In that scenario, the massive amount of capital tied up in the factory is idle for half the year. It turns over only twice a year. The workers are only producing surplus value for 6 months out of 12. The rest of the time is wasted in the friction of circulation. It is dead time.
And this is where the middleman swoops in to save the day.
Yes. The commercial capitalist, the massive wholesale auto buyer, steps in and says to the factory owner, I will buy your entire batch of 10,000 cars the minute they roll off the assembly line. I'll take them off your hands right now, but I want a 10% discount on the final retail price. Or the banker says, I will advance you the credit to buy your next batch of steel right now before your cars even sell, but I want 5% interest.
They drastically shorten the circulation time.
They dramatically increase the velocity of capital. Because the commercial capitalist buys the goods immediately, the industrialist gets their money back instantly. They can reinvest it the very next day. Suddenly, instead of waiting 3 months, the factory runs continuously. The capital turns over 4, 5, or 6 times a year. The workers are producing surplus value 12 months a year instead of 6.
I love this. I have the perfect analogy for this that grounds it in everyday life. It's exactly like a local independent restaurant deciding to use a modern food delivery app.
Okay, let's hear it.
When those apps first came out, restaurant owners looked at them and said, are you crazy? You want to take a massive 30% cut of my menu price? That wipes out my entire profit margin on that meal. I do all the cooking and you just drive it down the street.
The delivery app is acting as purely commercial capital here. They don't produce the commodity, they just circulate it.
Right. But then the restaurant owner realizes, before the app, I could only sell to the people physically sitting at my 10 tables. If the tables were full or if it was raining and no one walked in, I couldn't cook any more food. My kitchen was idle. The circulation time waiting for people to eat and pay was too slow.
Yes.
But with the app, I can sell food continuously. I don't have to wait for physical tables to clear. The app takes a massive 30% cut, yes, but because my kitchen is now churning out 300 meals a day instead of 50, my total daily profit skyrockets. The pie grows so much that the restaurant owner is thrilled to give the middleman a 30% slice.
If you take that analogy one step further, look at the experience of the workers in that kitchen. Before the app, the cooks might get a breather between the lunch and dinner rush. The friction of the market gave them a moment of rest. But once the app commercial capital removes the friction of circulation, the tablet pings constantly. The cooks are sweating, moving faster, producing surplus value every single minute of their shift.
Wow. Yeah, there are no breaks anymore.
The industrialist pays the middleman a discount, or pays the banker in interest rate, not out of charity, but because that functional division of labor allows an overall massive increase in the extraction of total surplus value from the workers. Mandel points out that this division of labor is a tremendous rationalization for the bourgeoisie as a class. It is cheaper and faster for society to have specialized transport, specialized banking, and specialized retail, rather than every single factory trying to run its own bank and its own global shipping fleet.
But I have to push back here because looking at the world today, it feels like this is mutated into something grotesque. Doesn't this mean that a massive chunk of society's total wealth and human intelligence is permanently tied up just in moving money and goods around?
Yeah, you could say that.
I mean, we have massive financial districts, high-frequency trading algorithms, huge companies like Amazon, whose entire genius isn't necessarily inventing new products, but shaving a microsecond off the circulation time. Entire industries dedicated to nothing but logistics, while the actual production of things people need feels entirely secondary.
You've hit on the exact critique Mandel makes. While this system is entirely rational for the capitalist class because it maximizes their overall profit and velocity, It reveals the immense, staggering overhead costs of a capitalist system compared to a hypothetical system that would produce directly for human needs.
Right.
The sheer amount of resources, labor, and capital permanently parked outside the realm of material production just to facilitate the buying and selling of commodities is a monument to the inefficiency of the market from a holistic human perspective.
That's a powerful way to frame it.
And furthermore, Mandel notes a dark historical reality. This commercial and banking capital wasn't just born nicely from industrial factories. It's older than industrial capitalism. Banking and merchant capital accumulated vast wealth long before the Industrial Revolution. Through the plunder of peasants, piracy, the colonial slave trade, and unequal exchange with pre-capitalist societies. The industrial factory found this massive reservoir of bloody merchant wealth already existing, and allied with it to speed up production.
Okay, so the middlemen ensure the engine runs at maximum speed. The friction of circulation is eliminated. The factory is churning out goods 12 months a year continuously. The delivery apps are working flawlessly. But if we're making goods faster and faster and expanding reproduction continuously, we hit a mathematical wall. Who is actually going to buy all this stuff?
That is the big question.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This brings us to a massive historical debate, and one of the most famous figures in Marxist economics, Rosa Luxemburg. Let's talk about her critique of the realization problem and the debate over imperialism.
Luxemburg looked at Marx's reproduction schemas, the mathematical formulas he used to show how capitalism grows. And she asked a seemingly simple, devastating question. Where does the purchasing power come from to realize the accumulated portion of surplus value?
Let's translate that. She's essentially asking, in a closed system, who is the new customer?
Exactly. If capitalism is constantly expanding, creating a growing surplus of goods every single year, someone has to buy those goods to turn them back into cash. Who is it? She systematically eliminates the options. It can't be the workers, because the capitalist class pays the workers out of their own pockets. You don't get richer by paying your own employees more money just so they can buy your own goods. That's a zero-sum loop.
Right, that's just moving money from your left pocket to your right pocket. The total wealth of the capitalist hasn't grown.
And it can't be the capitalists themselves. While capitalists buy luxury goods and new machinery from each other, how does the capitalist class as a whole get richer by just endlessly trading their surplus products back and forth with money they already have?
So she concludes
What?
that the system is mathematically impossible.
She concludes that capitalism cannot survive in a closed system. It must find fresh purchasing power outside of itself. It must violently force non-capitalist social classes like independent peasants or pre-capitalist societies in the global south to buy its goods. It must plunder a non-capitalist imperialist milieu to survive.
It's like a vampire. Luxemburg is essentially saying capitalism is a vampire that cannot survive on its own blood. It has to constantly venture out and find fresh, human, blood-new, non-capitalist markets to drain. And the terrifying logical conclusion for theory is, what happens when the vampire turns the whole world into vampires? What happens when the whole globe is fully integrated into capitalism and there are no external markets left?
According to Luxemburg, the moment the non-capitalist world is fully absorbed and destroyed, capitalism will face an absolute terminal collapse. It will starve to death. It was an incredibly powerful anti-imperialist thesis that deeply resonated with revolutionaries fighting colonial powers.
It sounds incredibly convincing. It perfectly explains the brutal history of colonialism and the scramble for Africa. So why does Mandel disagree with her?
Mandel has immense respect for Luxemburg's anti-imperialist conclusions, but he argues she made a fatal methodological error in her reading of Marx's math. She confused two different levels of abstraction. She confused capital in its totality with the competition of many capitals.
Okay, what is the difference between those two things?
When she says the capitalist class cannot enrich itself by buying its own surplus product, she is treating the entire capitalist class as if it were a single, giant, perfectly coordinated corporation. A single, global monopoly.
Oh, I see.
If there were only one giant capitalist owning everything, she would be absolutely right. But capitalism isn't a monolith. It is defined by private property, anarchy, and competition. Capitalists can and do grow richer by aggressively buying and selling to each other, out-competing one another, stealing market share, and expanding at wildly different rates.
So the vampire can technically feed on itself.
Mathematically, yes.
Yeah.
And to prove it, Mandel walks us through Marx's expanded reproduction formula. This is where the theory gets highly mathematical, but it is absolutely crucial to understanding the blueprint. The formula for economic equilibrium is this: I sub V plus I sub S alpha plus I sub S gamma equals 2 sub C plus 2 sub S beta.
Okay, if I'm going to understand this without a chalkboard, you're going to have to translate that algebra into a tangible scenario for me.
Let's build a thought experiment. Imagine two hypothetical countries. Country I is entirely dedicated to Department 2. They mine steel and build massive industrial robots. That's all they do. Country 2 is entirely dedicated to Department 2. They grow wheat and sew blue jeans. Consumer goods.
Okay. Country 1 makes robots. Country 2 makes jeans. I'm following.
The left side of the equation represents the new value created by the workers in Country I, the robot builders. This includes their wages and the surplus value their boss consumes. Now, these robot builders can't eat robots. They need to buy food and clothes. So the left side of the equation represents the massive demand for consumer goods generated by the industrial sector. Let's say it's $100 million worth of demand. The robot makers take their $100 million in wages, walk over to Country 2 and say, we want to buy your jeans. Exactly.
Yeah.
Now look at the right side of the equation. That represents the constant capital of Country 2, the consumer goods sector. This represents the machinery that the jeans factories need to buy to replace their old sewing machines and expand their operations. So the right side is the demand for machines generated by the consumer goods sector. Let's say they also need $100 million worth of new robots.
So the formula is just establishing a perfect trade. The amount of jeans the robot makers want to buy must perfectly equal the amount of robots the jeans makers want to buy. 100 million trades for 100 million.
Precisely. That is the exact mathematical condition for economic equilibrium. They trade with each other. Country I sells robots to Country 2, and in exchange, Country 2 feeds Country 2. They don't need a third non-capitalist party to inject new money. They don't need imperialism to balance the books. They just need perfect proportionate balance between the two departments.
But wait, if Mandel is right, and the vampire can survive just by feeding on itself through internal trade and competition, doesn't that just mean it's going to mutate and tear itself apart internally? Because earlier, you hammered home the point about the organic composition of capital. You said capitalists are always competing, always upgrading technology to use more machines and fewer humans. If they are constantly chaotically upgrading, how can they possibly maintain that perfect 100 million to 100 million mathematical balance?
They can't. That is the absolute genius of Mandel's counter-argument. You've hit the nail on the head. Because of the rising organic composition of capital, because capitalists in the gene sector are constantly trying to automate, using more robots and firing workers to beat their rivals, the demand for robots will almost always grow wildly faster than the demand for genes. The right side of the equation violently pulls away from the left side.
The scale tips. Country 2 suddenly demands 150 million in robots, but Country 1 only needs 100 million in genes.
Exactly. Perfect equilibrium is practically impossible in a competitive system driven by technological revolution. Capitalism doesn't need external imperialist markets to find buyers, though it gladly uses them to delay the pain. But its own internal friction inevitably creates massive systemic disproportions. It produces too many consumer goods that a relatively shrinking automated workforce cannot afford to buy. And it produces machines at a rate that the chaotic, uncoordinated market cannot seamlessly absorb.
So Luxemburg's math was flawed, but her historical instinct was totally right. Capitalism did violently enrich itself via imperialism, but even if it hadn't, its own internal math makes smooth, infinite growth impossible. The engine is designed to vibrate itself out of alignment.
Exactly.
And this inherent mathematical impossibility of maintaining perfect equilibrium triggers the most brutal, dramatic feature of the capitalist system. It leads us directly into the crisis of overproduction.
This is where Mandel brings all the theoretical threads together. How does Marx actually explain the spectacular economic crashes that rock the globe every decade or so? Mandel starts by rigorously rejecting two simplistic, very popular economic theories regarding crises.
Let's hear them. Why do most people think crashes happen?
The first simplistic theory is pure underconsumptionism. This is the very common intuitive idea that crises happen solely because greedy capitalists don't pay workers enough to buy all the goods they produce. The goods pile up, and the system crashes.
That seems to make total sense, right? If you don't pay your workers a living wage, they can't shop at the mall, the stores go bankrupt, the factories close. Why is that theory wrong?
Mandel dismisses it as a reformist platitude. It's wrong because it completely forgets about Department Oil. Under capitalism, a massive, overwhelming portion of commodities are machines, raw steel, heavy logistics, and industrial chemicals. Workers are never intended to buy those things. So simply raising workers' wages so they can buy more food and flat-screen TVs tells you absolutely nothing about how to solve an overproduction crisis of 1 million tons of industrial steel or microchips.
Ah, okay. The workers buying more jeans doesn't help the factory that makes industrial cranes. What's the second simplistic theory?
Pure disproportionism. This is the idea that crises are just an administrative glitch, a lack of communication. It argues that if we just had better planners, better data, or a giant government cartel coordinating between the machine sector and the consumer sector, we could match supply and demand perfectly and avoid overproduction.
If we just tweak the algorithm, the engine will run smoothly.
Exactly. But Mandel points out that Marx fundamentally rejected this too. You cannot have perfect coordination in a system based on private property and cutthroat competition. Disproportion isn't a glitch, it's the default state of the anarchy of the free market. Capitalists hide their data from rivals. They overinvest blindly to capture market share.
So if a crash isn't just caused by underpaid workers, and it's not just a lack of administrative planning, what is the true Marxist cause of a crisis?
It is a highly volatile three-pronged combination. One, the declining rate of profit, caused by that rising organic composition of capital we keep coming back to. Two, the anarchy of production, where every capitalist blindly expands. And three, the strict limits placed on mass consumption by the wage system.
All three happening simultaneously, feeding off each other.
Yes. And what is crucial to understand is the function of the crisis. In Marxist theory, a crash isn't an accident. It isn't a mistake. It is an objective, brutal mechanism that capitalism uses to correct itself.
Wait, it uses the crash? The crash is a feature, not a bug.
Let's look at the mechanics. Because of constant technological advancement, the actual labor value of commodities tends to decline. It takes less human sweat to make a car today than it did 50 years ago. But market prices often stay artificially inflated during an economic boom due to credit and speculation. When the bubble finally bursts, the crisis forces a violent, rapid adjustment of market prices down to their actual declining values. This results in what Mandel calls a massive devalorization of capital.
So we see massive bankruptcies, foreclosures, stark market crashes, banks failing.
Yes. Weak firms are violently destroyed. Their expensive machinery is sold off for pennies on the dollar at auction to the surviving strong firms. The massive spike in unemployment drives wages into the floor. And what happens when wages drop? And you can buy your bankrupt rival's factory for practically nothing.
Your overhead plummets, so your profit margins shoot back up.
The crisis resets the board. It forcibly restores the rate of profit for the survivors, allowing the massive accumulation process to start all over again.
It's like a controlled forest fire. Or, well, an uncontrolled forest fire. It looks like an absolute apocalyptic disaster to the individual trees, which represent the working-class families losing their homes and the smaller capitalists going bankrupt. But for the forest ecosystem as a whole, meaning the overarching capitalist class, it clears out the deadwood. It burns off the excess, inefficient capital, so new growth, meaning new profitability, can start again from the ashes.
That is a perfect analogy. And it highlights the immense structural cruelty of the mechanism. The engine must regularly burn its own components to maintain its RPM.
But wait, I have to ask, if the whole problem starts because the profit rate is dropping and goods are piling up, why not just step in and fix it? Why doesn't the government proactively force wages up? If you raise wages massively, the workers could buy the excess goods, clear the inventory, and we avoid the forest fire entirely. Why doesn't capitalism just do that?
This raises an important question, and Mandel addresses this exact utopian scenario. It goes back to the core DNA of the system's surplus value. If you suddenly raise wages to allow workers to clear the inventory of consumer goods, you are fundamentally redistributing the national income. You are taking a massive slice out of capitalist profits to give to the workers' wages.
Right, which sounds great for society.
But what happens when capitalist profits take a sudden, sharp, legally mandated plunge?
The capitalists panic.
They panic, and they immediately go on strike. They stop investing. They stop buying new machines. They stop expanding factories. The moment profits drop, Department ID's sector producing heavy machinery and raw materials experiences a total collapse in demand. So you tried to solve the crisis in the consumer sector by raising wages, but in doing so you triggered an absolute devastating depression in the industrial machinery sector. Investment collapses, millions of workers in Department I are laid off, their purchasing power vanishes, and the systemic crisis happens anyway. The system is fundamentally trapped.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't. Any measure to reverse the decline of the profit rate shrinks the consumer market. Any attempt to expand the consumer market destroys the profit rate and kills industrial investment. The system is locked in an inescapable mathematical contradiction.
Correct.
Which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. The realization that the system is structurally trapped leads to the final fatal flaw that Marx identified decades before modern economists really caught on. What happens when capitalists look at this trapped system, realize they can't make a good profit, and just refuse to play the game entirely? This is the phenomenon of money hoarding and the illusion of infinite growth, covered in parts 12 and 13 of Mandel's introduction.
This is where Marx's foresight is truly staggering. Decades before John Maynard Keynes made it the absolute centerpiece of modern macroeconomics during the Great Depression, Marx identified money hoarding as a massive, destabilizing force in the commodity economy.
Money hoarding, you mean billionaires just sticking cash into the mattress?
Essentially, yes. It is the act of withdrawing wealth from productive circulation. Marx starts from a basic, logical assumption. For the economy to flow smoothly and avoid a crash, all the income generated in the production process must be spent, either spent on consumer goods by workers or spent on new machines and expansion by capitalists. If you inject purchasing power into the system, it must be expelled somewhere else to keep the cycle moving.
Money has to move. If it stops, the engine stalls.
But the very functioning of modern industrial capitalism forces capitalists to periodically hoard massive amounts of money. Mandel highlights a concept called the discontinuous renewal of fixed capital.
What does that mean in practice?
Think about a massive modern semiconductor factory. The machines inside are replaced bit by bit, screw by screw, every single day. A capitalist buys a massive, billion-dollar state-of-the-art assembly line, and they expect it to last for 7 to 10 years. For those 7 to 10 years, they are slowly accumulating a depreciation fund. They are siphoning off a portion of their profits and hoarding it in cash or highly liquid assets, saving up for the day the machine finally breaks or becomes technologically obsolete.
So for almost a decade, they are actively pulling money out of the economy and just sitting on it?
Yes. And because brutal competitive cycles often force entire industries to upgrade their technology at roughly the same time to stay relevant, you get massive systemic swings across the whole economy. For years, vast amounts of money are hoarded, starving the economy of demand and slowing growth. And then suddenly the 10-year mark hits, a new technology is invented, the profit expectations look right, and the entire industry violently dumps billions of dollars into the market all at once to buy new machines.
It's exactly like a biological circulatory system. If the blood flows smoothly and consistently, the body is healthy. But hoarding is like blood pooling in one major organ for years. The rest of the economic body is deprived of oxygen, growth slows down, unemployment slowly rises, and then suddenly the organ flushes all that pooled blood back into the system at once, spiking the blood pressure, overwhelming the veins, and causing chaos. If the money doesn't flow in balance, the economic body eventually goes into cardiac arrest.
And that biological volatility brings us to Mandel's overarching thesis regarding the entire capitalist mode of production. He describes it as a terrifyingly dynamic process. Capitalism is driven by an absolute unquenchable thirst for surplus value. That thirst is the motor that pushes incredible technological revolution, global communications, and massive logistics networks that connect the entire planet.
It builds the modern world. We can't deny the sheer productive capacity it has unleashed.
It does. But, as Mandel starkly points out, this frenetic, desperate pursuit of additional wealth, simply to create even more wealth, becomes increasingly fundamentally divorced from actual human needs.
We get high-frequency trading algorithms that execute trades in nanoseconds, but we can't build affordable housing.
We get an immense mountain of disposable commodities distributed with lightning speed, while the wealth concentrates in the hands of an ever smaller percentage of the population. And because this whole avalanche of growth is built on the contradictory DNA of the commodity and private property, because it relies on constantly squeezing surplus value out of workers while simultaneously needing those same workers to act as a market to sell to, it mathematically cannot continue uninterrupted.
It leads to periodic, unavoidable convulsions. The forest fires are baked into the blueprint.
Yes. Mandel concludes that these crises aren't policy failures. They aren't caused by a bad president or a greedy banker or a flawed algorithm. They are the unavoidable heartbeat of the system. Therefore, he argues, no amount of anti-cyclical state policies, no amount of Keynesian stimulus checks, no amount of financial engineering by the Federal Reserve can permanently solve a contradiction that is rooted in the very nature of producing for profit rather than human need. For Mandel, the only permanent remedy to these convulsions is the total elimination of class society and the capitalist mode of production itself.
Wow. We have covered an immense amount of ground today, and it forces us to look at the world around us with an entirely different lens. Which leaves you with a final thought to mull over as you watch the news this week. Do our modern attempts to fix the economy with massive central bank bailouts, algorithmic trading, and artificial intelligence actually stabilize the system? Or are we just taking that complex, volatile engine we talked about at the beginning and building a faster, more efficient pressure cooker with a welded shut release valve? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. True understanding requires looking past the surface noise, past the simple diagnostic X-ray, and examining the complex, contradictory mechanics underneath, exactly as Mandel did with Marx. Until next time,